This morning we're going to be talking about the subject of the loss of mental health. We're going to be looking today in the book of 1 Kings. If you want to take your Bibles and turn there with me to 1 Kings 19. This is a great illustration that God gives us of an individual that is considered to be one of the great men of God who came into a time of his life when he was either depressed or highly discouraged. And as we talk about this morning, I hope that you will be able to draw from our time together how to, in a sense of the word, get back to a healthy mental health. As we look at this subject, I will say to you that many times believers today battle with what I call discouragement. That discouragement sometimes can almost mimic or even look like depression. I think sometimes believers find themselves sensing blue moments in their life or depressed moments in their life. And I will say to you that depression is really motivated or comes to us two ways. One way is in a clinical setting, it may be a chemical imbalance. There are those that need medication to help to balance out their thinking so that they can be about their normal lives, if you will. That medication normalizes them. That's probably a very small percentile of the population. The other type of depression is circumstantial. The circumstances of life so often takes place, and when it does, we may feel down or blue, and we may even sense depression. That depression is not solved by medication. It's usually solved by when we deal with the circumstances in a healthy way. The character in the Bible that we're going to study about this morning was of the latter. It was not a chemical imbalance. It was a circumstance that took place in his life. And because of that circumstance, he found himself suicidal, depressed, running from the situation rather than dealing with the situation. In fact, when we think about this individual in the Bible, it's always amazing to me how strong a follower of God he is or was. Yet, even in the strength of being able to see God do great things, he still slipped into these moments of depression. You know what that says to me, folks? That says to me that all of us are going to deal with it. All of us will have depressive moments in our lives. All of us will feel down, if you will, because of things that take place in our lives. Again, I want you to understand that I'm not speaking from a standpoint that I want you to feel bad about the circumstance. It's normal. If you say to me, Pastor, I've never felt depressed, well, either lying is your problem or you just don't face reality. Because we all have those down moments in our life, and that's what we're going to deal with today. Knowing that it's a reality, but then more than that, what are we going to do about it? How are we able to get beyond that moment? Now listen carefully. If you don't deal with it appropriately, it can be more than damaging to you, in the sense of the word. It really can take hold of your life and all of a sudden become a normality in your life, and you don't even know how to get out of it. You need to learn how to deal with depression, and you need to learn how to not only deal with it, but you need to learn how to overcome it as time moves on. So let me look at a few verses with you this morning, and I want to give you 6 things that you can take away from my time with you today. We're going to be looking at the great victory on Mount Carmel that Elijah was able to experience. And I will kind of talk a little bit about that in chapter 18. We'll not read from that text, but we'll talk about it. And then the grief resulting from a warning, how that just this event that comes to Elijah, all of a sudden he spirals downward look at the glorious assignment given to Elijah. And number 5, the gift of companionship provided by God. And then I'm going to sort of conclude our time with the guidance needed to be restored. I'm going to give you about 10 things that you can do to ensure that you can be successful in moving through depression, or even to hedge against depression coming upon you. And I hope when I get to that point, you will take some good notes, or at least go back and re-listen to this time. That will help you to be reminded how to be able to come out of those dark days that engulf so many people's lives. Let me just read the first 4 verses of chapter 19. The Bible says that Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. And Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. And he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die. These are suicidal thoughts. And he said, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Let's pray. Father, Lord, I recognize that depression is about all of us. Everybody goes through blue moments in their life or down moments in their lives. And sometimes those things begin to stay with us long enough that we find ourselves even depressed. Lord, I believe that you, with your tender care, you've given to us a way out of those things. And Father, most certainly for those that are in a clinical setting, have a chemical imbalance, most certainly, Father, you've given the medication created around us that can be provided to help people have a normal life. Lord, today we're not speaking about the clinical side, we're speaking about the circumstantial. So, Father, help us to understand how we can deal with depression and be successful, Father. We might be victorious over it rather than it being victorious over us. Father, I pray that you will be honored by what we say today. In Jesus' name, amen. If you were to go back to chapter 19, you will recognize with me that here is Elijah on Mount Carmel, and he is in a duel, if you will, with about 40 prophets of Baal. And that contest is to determine which God is the real God. The God of the 40 prophets of Baal, or is it the God of Elijah? You will remember as you go back and reread and reminded of that story, that how that there was an altar built, and Elijah taunts the 40 prophets of Baal and saying to them, maybe your God is asleep. Maybe you ought to cry out even louder. And boy, I like this story of Elijah and how he speaks to these prophets of Baal, and they end up screaming and yelling and cutting themselves, but yet nothing happens. And finally, Elijah says, okay, it's my turn. And they had broken down the altar. He repairs the altar. They pour all this water on it. He prays to God and says, prove that you are who you are. And fire and brimstone comes down and laps up the water all around the altar, and even destroys or consumes the altar itself. Victory is won. The God of Elijah has been proven to be the one true God. People of Israel had been remaining silent through the whole event. Now shouts and chases after these prophets of Baal and slays all 40 of them. A great victory, would you agree? Nod your head. Would you agree a great victory? Did you know that sometimes after great events in our life, we are set up for depression? Y'all capture that? Sometimes after great events in our life. Now what happened to Elijah? He expended a lot of physical, spiritual, and mental energy. He was depleted. And all of a sudden, he's now faced with a problem. And at that moment of weakness, here's a great man of God. At that moment of weakness, he hears something. And when he does, we find the great victory on Mount Carmel is now overshadowed by this depressive event in Elijah's life. Look at point number 2 is the grief resulting from a warning. Look at verse number 1 again. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah did in verse 1. Now look at what Jezebel says in verse number 2. And Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah. And here's the message that was coming, saying, so let the gods do to me, and by the way, God will do some things to her later on, do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. You think Elijah knew Jezebel meant business? Oh yeah, she really meant business. She was an evil woman. And Elijah knew how evil she was. What happens to Elijah? He hears this. Now, look up here for a moment. Elijah had his eyes on God through everything that Elijah was able to do until now. You think that Elijah had not seen the power of God on Mount Carmel? Obviously. Elijah had seen people raised from the dead. But what does Elijah all of a sudden do? He takes his eyes off God and puts it on the warning, the threat. He hears what Jezebel says she's going to do. Now, don't you know that Elijah could have just prayed and says, God, would you just zap Jezebel? You think God would have done it? Absolutely. God's done everything else he's prayed about. Why not this one thing? But all of a sudden, he loses his, listen carefully now, he loses his faith. And what happens? Verse 3. Here is Elijah now. And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life. He now runs what God has called him to do. And came to Beersheba that belongeth unto Judah, and left his servant there. You ought to, I'm not giving you points like I usually do, but you ought to jot down a few things. He runs away from the calling of God. God did not tell him to go to Beersheba. God wanted him to be right where he was. But look at what else happens in this passage. He leaves his servant. That's called loneliness. He's all alone. He separates himself from those around him that care about him. And then when he finds himself away from God and he finds himself all alone, how does he respond in verse 4? But he himself went a day's journey, again he's alone, into the wilderness. Isn't that what depression feels like? That you're in the wilderness all by yourself and nobody knows what's going on in your life but you, and you feel or sense that nobody really cares about what's going on in your life. Elijah is in the wilderness. And he came and found himself under a juniper tree. And what does he want to do? He wants to die. This is the suicidal thinking that is now sweeping across the mind of Elijah. Think about that if you will. You say, well, he's asking God to kill him. Well, guess what? That's what suicide is. You're wanting to die. And you want somebody to do it, or God forbid, you'll come to a point in your life where you'll say that God won't do it, I'll just take matters in my own hands and I'll do it myself. We would all look at Elijah's life and say, what a waste it would be if he had died at this moment in time. But he's in such a depressive state. Now listen, he's not thinking clearly. People who are depressed don't think clearly. That's why companionship is so vitally important for all of us, if you will. So with this in mind, we see the grief resulting from a warning. We see the threat from Jezebel, and we see the torment from fear. All of a sudden, Elijah is afraid. And fear has now swept across his life, and that fear has become what was more important than the very calling of God. Let's look at the gracious act of God now. Now listen carefully. We see what Elijah's going through, but now let's see how God deals with it. Now listen carefully. This is very important for us to understand. That God is concerned about you. He's concerned about me. No matter what the circumstances of life are, no matter, listen carefully, no matter what you've done, I would think running from God would be pretty bad, don't you think so? No matter what you've done, God has a plan. And He wants to bring you back where you can become usable for His glory once again. So let's look at the gracious acts of the Lord. What did He do? Look with me in verse number 5. And verse 5 through 14 helps us to see a lot of this, if you will. But in verse number 5, the Bible says, "And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, the angel touched him and said unto him, Arise and eat." What's the first thing that God does right here? It's a provision of food. God provides food for Elijah. Now listen carefully. Now I believe this is going to be the right menu. We need to make sure that we're eating the right things. I don't want to get too deeply in a course of things that we ought to be eating on a regular basis, but I will say to you that putting in junk food is not the healthy thing to do when you're depressed. You ought not do the things like that because it's going to cause your body to respond in a negative way. You need to eat a healthy diet, if you will. So the provision of food. What else does he do here? And he looked and said, and behold, there was a cake baking on the coals, and a cruse of water, something about drinking water that helps, at his head. And he did eat and drink and laid him down again. So secondly, we see provision of food, the provision of rest. So Elijah was getting the right nourishment in, and he was resting. Now listen carefully. Depressive people sometimes go overboard when sleep is concerned. What happens when a person becomes depressed? They want to stay inside, leave me alone. I don't want to go outside, and I will stay in bed, pull the covers over my head, and stay asleep. There are times that you need to rest if you're depressed. If you have expended yourself physically, you need to rest. I think that's why God gave a day of rest. That we need to be away from the things of our life and to be able to reconnect, if you will,